Hello and welcome to this video on Unit 3. In Unit 3 you will be reading Chapter 3 of our textbook. You should focus on the section Introducing Deductive Reasoning. You should also pay very close attention to the section on valid and invalid arguments. And finally, focus on the section Sound and Unsound Arguments. Once again, remember that the non-graded learning activity is very important. It will help you determine whether you are understanding the concepts in the unit. Reading the unit lesson will also be a very helpful way to get a clear and concise summary of the concepts in Unit 3. Let us now talk about some of the most important concepts in Unit 3. Unit 3 deals with a specific type of reasoning, deductive reasoning. In deductive reasoning, we are concerned with whether the conclusion follows logically or necessarily, given that the premises are true. If in fact the conclusion does follow logically or necessarily, then the argument is valid or truth preserving. In other words, if the premises of a given deductive argument are true and the conclusion is necessarily true, then the argument is valid. This means that the truth of the premises is preserved in the conclusion. Let us look at an example of a valid argument. All people who live in Alabama are people who live in Canada. All people who live in Canada are people who live in Europe. Therefore, all people who live in Alabama are people who live in Europe. This argument is valid because if the premises were true, the conclusion would follow logically or necessarily. Here's a visual representation which shows us why the conclusion would follow. Notice that the people who live in Alabama are inside the group or category of people who live in Europe. This is another way of saying that the conclusion follows logically, or the conclusion would be necessarily true if the premises were true, which is just to say that the argument is valid. Of course, we know that the premises in this argument are false, but the argument is, as we have seen, valid or well-reasoned. This tells us that arguments can be well-reasoned even when the premises are false. Of course, we do not only want arguments that are valid or well-reasoned, we also want arguments to have true premises and true conclusions. That is to say, we want our arguments to have premises which are about facts, which lead to conclusions that are true. Thus, we need another criterion, and that is the criterion of soundness. Soundness means that an argument has true premises and that it is also valid. Here's an example. All lakes are bodies of water. Lake Huron is a lake. Therefore, Lake Huron is a body of water. We can look at a similar visual representation that shows us why the argument is valid. Notice that Lake Huron is inside the group or category of bodies of water, which means that the conclusion follows necessarily, and thus the argument is valid. This is a sound argument because it is valid and the premises are also true. This means that this argument actually tells us something about the world that we live in. Ultimately, we want deductive arguments not only to be valid or well-reasoned, but also tell us something about our world, and thus we want the premises to be true as well. In other words, we want sound arguments, and by definition, sound arguments are valid and have true premises.